Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be looking at something that I think is pretty relevant to all of us, and that's American politics. But more specifically, how our political affiliations have become so intertwined with our social identities. And to help us unpack this whole thing, we're going to be taking a look at Lilliana Mason's book, Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity. This book is really fascinating, and it offers some pretty insightful explanations for the current state of our political landscape.
Yeah, I think anyone who's paying even a little attention to politics these days can feel that things have gotten, well, let's just say more than a little heated. And Mason does a great job of getting to the root of why that is.
So to kick things off, I think it's worth highlighting the Robbers Cave experiment that Mason discusses early on in the book. This experiment was done way back in the 1950s, and it involved a group of 22 boys, all white, all middle class, and all Protestant. Basically, they were all pretty similar. These boys were randomly divided into two groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and then they were put through a series of competitions at a summer camp.
What's so fascinating about this experiment is that these boys had no pre-existing differences to speak of. They were essentially all the same, yet simply by being assigned to a group, they quickly developed strong biases against the other team.
It's kind of wild how quickly things escalated. They started calling each other names, sabotaging each other's efforts. They even started exaggerating their own team's achievements.
Yeah, there's this one example in the book where both groups were shown the same number of beans that they'd supposedly collected, but each group vehemently insisted that their team had collected more.
It really shows how powerful group identity can be, even when those groups are formed arbitrarily and there's no real basis for rivalry.
And I think what's really concerning is how easily these biases can form. It makes you wonder how much of our own political beliefs are actually based on, genuine policy differences versus just aligning ourselves with our chosen tribe.
Right, it's like we're hardwired to divide ourselves into us and them, even when there's no logical reason to do so. And this is something that Mason really digs into in her book. She argues that our political affiliations are becoming less about policy and more about what she calls mega identities, which I have to admit sounds a little intimidating.
Yeah, mega identities might sound a bit dramatic, but it's actually a pretty accurate way to describe what's happening. Essentially, it means that our political parties are no longer just about our stances on taxes or healthcare. They've become intertwined with a whole host of other social groups and identities. So your political party might now signal your views on race, religion, geographic location, even lifestyle choices.
So it's like casting a single vote is now a statement about your entire worldview. No wonder things feel so much more intense, like every election is a battle for the soul of the nation or something.
Exactly. And Mason argues that this sorting of social identities into partisan camps has been steadily increasing over the past few decades, which has contributed to this heightened polarization we see today.
It's like everyone's retreating to their respective corners and digging in their heels, and there's less and less room for middle ground or compromise.
Right. The book actually dives into how the demographic makeup of the two major parties has shifted dramatically between the 1950s and the 2010s. Back in the 50s, you might have had a conservative Democrat in the South who felt connected to both liberals and conservatives on different issues.
Yeah, it seems like there was more overlap back then, more nuance in people's political identities. But by the 2010s, the parties had become much more ideologically and socially distinct. Democrats leaning more liberal, Republicans more conservative, and that middle ground just seemed to evaporate.
And what's interesting is that Mason doesn't simply argue that this sorting is driven by differing policy preferences. She suggests that social factors might actually play a larger role than policy in shaping our political attitudes and actions.
Hold on, so you're saying it's not just about disagreeing on policy. There's something else going on here, something deeper that's driving this division.
Right. She uses the concept of mashing to illustrate this point. Basically, she argues that even when people have moderate views on policy, if their social identity aligns strongly with one party, they're more likely to be biased in favor of that party, regardless of the specific policy being discussed.
So even if I agree with someone on a particular issue, if they belong to the opposite political party, my initial reaction might be negative, just because of their affiliation.
That's essentially what Mason is suggesting. To give you a concrete example, she brings up the Cliven Bundy standoff in Nevada. This was back in 2014, where a rancher got into a dispute with the Bureau of Land Management over grazing fees.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That was all over the news.
Right. And what's interesting is how quickly the Bundy standoff became a national flashpoint, drawing in people from all over the country who had never even heard of Cliven Bundy before.
Like, people weren't really forming opinions. based on the details of the case. They were just choosing sides based on their pre-existing political identities.
Exactly. The Bundy standoff became a symbol of the broader cultural and political divides in the country. It tapped into those mega identities and fueled the us versus them mentality. People saw it through the lens of their existing beliefs and affiliations rather than engaging with the issue on its own merits.
It really makes you think about how much of our political discourse is driven by these underlying social and emotional factors. If it's not just about policy differences, then what is it about this social sorting that makes us so polarized? Why are we so quick to demonize the other side?
Well, that brings us to the emotional landscape of polarization, which is where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how social sorting intensifies partisan emotions like anger and enthusiasm, and how those emotions shape our political behavior.
Thank you for listening to Rambling Dan Rowe's Deep Dive Book Reviews. Please help support our channel by clicking the like and subscribe button. Thank you.
So last time we were talking about how emotionally charged things have gotten in American politics. It's not just about disagreeing on policy anymore. It's about feeling really connected to your political team and feeling angry or even hostile towards people who identify with the other side.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's constantly on edge, always ready to jump into a political argument. It's honestly pretty exhausting. So how does this all tie back to the idea of social sorting that we were discussing? Is Mason saying that simply being part of a group makes us more emotional about politics?
It's not quite that simple. It's more about the fact that as our political parties become more and more aligned with our social identities, the stakes of political disagreement feel higher. It's not just about policy anymore. It's about your whole identity and the groups you belong to.
So if my political party represents not just my policy preferences, but also my race, my religion, my way of life, then any attack on my party feels like an attack on me personally.
Exactly. And because these mega identities encompass so much of who we are, they trigger really powerful emotional responses when they're challenged or threatened. Mason actually cites experimental evidence showing that even a simple threat to group status can evoke strong feelings of anger and enthusiasm in people who are highly partisan.
So it's not just that we're choosing sides based on our social groups. It's that those groups are making us more emotionally invested in the outcome.
Right. It's like we're rooting for our team to win, even if we don't fully understand or agree with all the plays being called.
Like we're more concerned with scoring points against the other side than actually finding solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. And a great example of this is the 2013 government shutdown. That wasn't really a rational policy debate. It was a battle of partisan wills fueled by anger and a desire to obstruct the other side at any cost.
Or think about the 2016 election. It felt like emotions were running higher than ever before, with both sides demonizing each other and engaging in some pretty hostile rhetoric.
Yeah, the rise of Donald Trump was particularly interesting in this context because he was really a master at tapping into those raw partisan emotions. He channeled people's anger and frustration towards a common enemy, even when his own policy positions were kind of vague or inconsistent.
So if our political identities are so deeply intertwined with our emotions, is there any hope for bridging this divide? Are we doomed to be a nation perpetually at war with itself?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The good news is that Mason doesn't leave us with a sense of despair. She explores several potential solutions based on research in social psychology and political science.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. Give me some hope here. Where do we even begin to address this level of division?
Well, one promising approach is based on the concept of contact theory, which basically says that increasing meaningful interactions between members of different groups can help to reduce prejudice and foster understanding.
That makes sense intuitively. If I actually get to know someone from the other side on a personal level, maybe I'll see them as an individual rather than a stereotype. But how do we actually make that happen in our hyper-partisan world? It seems like everyone is retreating further into their echo chambers.
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be direct face-to-face contact. Even indirect contact, like having friends who are friends with people from the other side, can have a positive impact.
So expanding my social circle and being open to different perspectives could actually help to chip away at this polarization.
Right. The more we interact with people who hold different views, the more likely we are to see them as complex individuals with their own unique experiences and perspectives, rather than just representatives of a monolithic enemy group.
Okay, that's a good starting point. But is there anything else we can do? Is there anything leaders can do to set a better example? I'm thinking about politicians, pundits, even media figures who often seem to profit from stoking the flames of outrage.
You've hit on another important point. Mason suggests that a focus on social norms could make a big difference. If those in positions of power, politicians, commentators, media personalities, were to model more civil and respectful behavior in their discourse, it could help to shift the overall tone of political engagement.
You mean like stop demonizing the other side and actually engaging in good faith debate? It's hard to imagine that happening, but I see how it could make a difference. If people see their leaders engaging in respectful dialogue, maybe they'll be more inclined to do the same.
Exactly. It's about setting a new standard for political discourse. Right now, there's so much incentive to be outrageous, to grab attention by attacking your opponents and riling up your base. But if leaders started modeling more constructive behavior, it could have a ripple effect throughout society.
So we need to cool down the rhetoric and focus on what unites us as Americans, not what divides us. It sounds a little cheesy, but I genuinely believe it's true.
And that leads us to another potential solution, focusing on what are called superordinate goals. These are goals that transcend partisan divides and appeal to our shared identity as Americans.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples. I'm having trouble picturing Democrats and Republicans actually coming together on anything these days.
Well, think about issues like national security, economic prosperity, or protecting the environment. These are challenges that affect all of us, regardless of our political affiliation.
Right, in theory, we should be able to work together to find solutions. But in practice, it seems like even those issues get sucked into the partisan vortex.
I hear you. It's definitely a challenge, especially in the current climate. But Mason actually points back to the Robbers Cave experiment as a source of hope here. Remember how the researchers were able to reduce conflict between the groups?
Yeah, they did it by introducing those superordinate goals, like fixing the water supply or pooling their money for a movie. By working together towards a common objective, the boys were able to see past their group differences and recognize their shared humanity.
Exactly. So it's not impossible. It just requires finding those areas of common ground and highlighting them, reminding people that we do have shared interests.
So we've talked about contact social norms and superordinate goals. Are there any other ideas for bridging this divide?
Well, Mason also explores the role of self-affirmation, which might sound a bit unexpected in this context.
Self-affirmation, isn't that more of a self-help concept? How does that apply to politics?
It might seem like a stretch, but there's actually a lot of research showing that people with low self-esteem are more likely to cling tightly to group identities and exhibit hostility towards people outside those groups.
So if you're feeling insecure or threatened, you're more likely to seek validation through your political tribe and lash out at those who are different.
That's the general idea. And Mason argues that addressing underlying economic and social anxieties, things like job security, access to healthcare, affordable education, could potentially lessen people's need to seek validation solely through their group identities.
So if people feel more secure and confident in their own lives, they might be less likely to feel the need to put others down or see the world in such stark us versus them terms.
Precisely. It's about creating a society where people feel less threatened and more connected to each other regardless of their political beliefs.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the power of social sorting, the emotional dynamics of polarization, and some potential solutions. Is there anything else Mason discusses in the book? Any other factors that contribute to this polarization?
One final area she touches on is demographic trends and how those trends might impact the future of American politics.
Demographic trends.
Okay.
How does that come into play?
Well, the racial and ethnic makeup of the United States is changing. The country is becoming more diverse with a growing percentage of non-white citizens.
Right. And that's bound to have some kind of impact on the political landscape. But how exactly does she predict which way things will swing?
It's complicated, and she doesn't make any firm predictions, but she raises some interesting questions. For example, if racial and ethnic minorities continue to lean towards the Democratic Party, while white voters remain more aligned with the Republican Party, it could create a situation where the Democratic Party has a more consistent electoral advantage.
Interesting. So as the electorate becomes more diverse, the balance of power could shift,
Yeah.
potentially leading to a realignment of the parties.
That's one possibility, and that kind of realignment, if it were to happen, could potentially lead to less social homogeneity within the parties, making them less defined by these mega identities.
So maybe this demographic shift could actually be a force for reducing polarization.
It's certainly a possibility worth considering. Of course, how these demographic changes will actually play out politically is complex. It'll depend on a lot of factors, including how the parties adapt their strategies and how voters respond to these shifts.
Right, it's not a simple equation.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to think about how these demographic trends could shake things up. and maybe even create an opportunity for a more unified political landscape.
Absolutely. It underscores the fact that this polarization isn't static. It's dynamic, it's evolving, and there's always potential for change.
Yeah, it's a lot to process for sure. And it's easy to feel kind of helpless in the face of all this. Like,
Yeah.
what can we as individuals really do to change these big societal trends?
And that's where I think Mason's final point is so important. It's not just about understanding these dynamics on a societal level, it's also about recognizing how they play out in our own lives. One of the most valuable things you can take away from this book is a greater awareness of your own social identities and how they might be shaping your political views.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the us versus them mentality without even realizing it. We tend to surround ourselves with people who share our views, and that just reinforces our existing beliefs and makes it harder to see other perspectives.
Exactly. So I would encourage everyone listening to take some time to reflect on this. Think about your own social identities, your race, your religion, your socioeconomic status where you live, and how those things might be influencing your view of the political world.
It's like a challenge to step back and examine our own biases, right?
Mm.
To ask ourselves, am I more likely to agree with someone just because they're like me in some way, even if I don't actually agree with their stance on a particular issue?
Exactly. That kind of self-awareness is so crucial for breaking free from these mega identities and engaging in more open-minded and constructive conversations about politics.
It's about remembering that we're all complex individuals with a mix of beliefs and experiences, and we shouldn't let our political affiliations define us entirely or prevent us from connecting with people who see things differently.
Absolutely. It's about striking that balance between staying true to your own values and being open to understanding the values of others.
Well, I think this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I have a much better understanding of how our identities are shaping our political views and just how deep-seated these patterns really are.
Yeah, me too. It's definitely a timely book, and it provides a really insightful look at what's driving American politics today. I think there's some really valuable tools in here for navigating our increasingly polarized world.
So if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, I highly recommend checking out Uncivil Agreement: How Politics Became Our Identity. It's written by Lilliana Mason. It's a really engaging read, and it might just change the way you think about politics, too.
Even if you don't agree with everything Mason says, I think it's a worthwhile exercise to engage with these ideas and think about how they might apply to your own life and experiences.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today.